I recognize the member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the members' attention as I add my voice to this debate, which I have not yet spoken on, around this legislation. And I guess the reason that I want to speak, that I asked in caucus for, my caucus mate's approval to speak, is because I feel like some things have not been said in this debate. And in fact, often, particularly as my colleagues in the official opposition have spoken, I feel like they're debating a straw man, where in this case the straw man is the world that we would like to exist as opposed to the world that actually exists. The fact is that we already spend a lot of public money on policing drugs. That is not there may be different costs. There may be costs for slightly different forms of enforcement as we move to regulating legalized cannabis, but there have already been costs for years of criminalized cannabis, and those costs have also been borne by communities, and those costs have been borne by communities differently, depending on who we're talking about. So that's one thing that I want to talk about. And the other is, of course, the concern for public health. And there are already costs to public health. There is already public ill health as a result of cannabis. But it is very difficult to tackle that and to address it in a public health. It's very difficult to work towards public health using criminal law as your tool. So these are the two kind of themes that I want to address, which I don't feel have been addressed sufficiently thus far in the many words that have been spoken as we have debated this bill. So I would like to suggest that the sky is not falling with the legalization of cannabis. If anything, the sky has already fallen, and some of us just haven't recognized what's lying around our feet in our communities. So I went back. It's interesting when you go to do a bit of research on cannabis. A lot of the top hits in Google now are actually provided by folks who are interested in getting into the business of providing cannabis, and so it's sort of I had to sift through a few pages of results to find something that I could trust as a sort of neutral source of information about some of those costs to our society of both cannabis use and of cannabis criminalization. And I ended up finding a 2002 special committee on illegal cannabis that was done by the Canadian Senate. And so it was done in 2002, and it was referring back to the Ledane Commission, which was 30 years earlier. We have been discussing this and recognizing some of the folly of the criminalization of cannabis for a long time. And so some of the stats that I use may not be the most recent, but they speak to the long-standing fact that we use cannabis in Canada, and we have been using it for a long time. In 2002, the stats that they were referring to said that 30% of Canadians had used cannabis at some point, and Canada has one of the highest rates of use of cannabis amongst one of the highest rates of use among youth, and the average age of introduction to cannabis is 15 years old. So again, the sky is not falling, the sky has fallen. And if we look around in our communities, we can see that already. And so how do we deal with the actual society we are in? Recognizing too that no, in fact, I would push back, legislation does not change culture. Culture evolves, culture has its own methods of production and reproduction and evolution, and it doesn't, we can say the age at which people may legally acquire cannabis shall be 21 years old. I guarantee you that will not convince a single 15-year-old offered a toke at a party to not inhale. So let's dispense with that. In terms of the costs of drug enforcement, and again, this is a little bit old, but I appreciated the writing in this report, and the fact that I could easily access it, the fact that it wasn't written by a company that's invested in making profits off of cannabis. So these slightly old stats said that the cost of prosecuting drug offenses in 2001 was $57 million, with approximately $5 million, or roughly 10% of the total budget, relating to prosecuting cannabis possession offenses. So we have, as a society, we have invested a significant amount of money in prosecuting cannabis and prosecuting possession. In '99, it was estimated that Canadian criminal courts heard 34,000 drug cases, which involved more than 400,000 court appearances. I can think about all kinds of ways that I would rather spend our public dollars than prosecuting possession. And again, slightly old stats, but Correctional Service Canada, it said at the time, spent an estimated $169 million annually to address illicit drugs through incarceration. Incarceration, substance abuse programs, treatment programs, and security measures. And then the report, this report mentioned that a criminal conviction can negatively affect a person's financial situation, career options, career opportunities, and restrict travel, and it can be an important factor in future dealings with the criminal justice system. Now, like I said, I appreciated finding this report from 2002. I think where our understanding, or maybe our public conversation, has evolved since is on really unpacking for whom those negative impacts on their future is, who is most likely to be affected by that. And I'm quite, proud is not the right word, but I'm pleased that in this session of the House we have had the opportunity to talk about street checks. It's certainly a very alive topic, a very important subject of conversation and of learning for all of us in Nova Scotia right now, as Scott Wortley continues with his work with the Human Rights Commission. Much of that conversation is informed by conversations that have been happening in Ontario. We know that here, African Nova Scotians and other people of African descent are 3 times more likely to be stopped by police in street checks. Guess what happens sometimes when you get stopped randomly by the police on the street? Sometimes they find that you're in possession of marijuana. And strangely, or not strangely at all, quite predictably in fact, in Ontario, where some studies were done on this, they found that Black people were arrested for minor cannabis possession at 3 times the rates of white people in Toronto. And we don't have that breakdown of the data here, but I think it's fairly predictable that the findings, if the data were crunched in that way, would be similar. And so what we know is that some of the most vulnerable people in our in our communities, and people who have been made vulnerable through our history, through a history of first slavery and then unequal treatment in a range of different ways, including where people were allowed to settle and what rights they were given to that land and so forth, and just our deep-seated racism that is a part of our culture. We know that some people have been disproportionately affected by the criminalization of drugs. And in fact, in 2014, of 2,200 federal inmates serving sentences for drug possession, 12% of those inmates were Black, which is 3 times their proportion of the population. So we know that this change is coming. We know that the current status quo, which some of my colleagues seem to want to hold on to, has both not worked for public health. It has also actually been a disproportionate burden of injustice on some people in our society. Again, this is coming from Toronto, and I don't have access, or maybe those stats are out there, but I don't have them. But in Toronto, Black people with no history of criminal conviction have been 3 times more likely to be arrested on possession than white people of similar background, the only difference being their race. And there is no evidence. There is no evidence that Black people use drugs more often or more. They just get stopped more. They just get stopped more, exactly. So what does that mean moving forward? I mean, I heard it in my community as dispensaries started to pop up in this sort of gray zone between the announcement that marijuana would be legalized and this July 1st date, which maybe will become a September 1st date. You know, I live in a community where many people have had those impacts either on them or on family members, on friends, of a criminal conviction for drug possession. And now in our community, I certainly have 2 dispensaries in my community, and people are looking and saying, oh, and so these guys are just able to come out from the shadows and go into business, and how is that? And I still can't get, for example, a summer job because I have a criminal conviction on my record. And I think that there is more work to do to actually redress some of the injustice that has been visited on people through the criminalization of cannabis over many, many years. And I look forward to seeing how the province may move forward with that. And then I guess on the public health aspect of things, let's also talk about about the world we're actually in, right? Where young people, if they are of a mind to, or just make a bad decision, or just, you know, where it's so easy to end up trying pot. And of course we have this, we have a story, there's a story in our society of marijuana being more natural or less harmful, and that is true to some extent, but we also know that the drug supply, the marijuana supply, the cannabis supply, when did it go from marijuana to cannabis? I think that's also just part of like changing the story, but that the cannabis supply has changed over time such that now it is much, much, much more potent than it was in the 1960s. Through, you know, it's been bred to be strong, and I guess as a parent, I look forward No, I don't look forward, actually. But, my kids are not yet 10 years old. My daughter will turn 10 this summer. And I anticipate a time when I will go to a dispensary and I will ask the staff at that dispensary, find me the brand of cannabis with the lowest THC, and I'm gonna stock it in my house. I'm gonna tell my kids where it is. And I'm gonna say, please don't ever use this, or please don't use this until you're away at university, but take it with you and use this one, because I'm terrified of them using just what would come out at a party without knowing. I mean, it's the same way as I have on occasion gone through the craft brews looking for the beer that is 4.5% alcohol instead of 8.5 or 9% alcohol. I want to be able to look at the cannabis on offer, not because I necessarily want to smoke any, but I want to be able to find the stuff that feels safest. Because we are talking about public health and we're talking about harm reduction, and that is the conversation that we should be having for the society that we are actually living in and that we are actually legislating for. I have a dear friend whose son suffered a psychotic break after using cannabis. To her understanding, it's the only time he's ever used cannabis, and the THC in that cannabis was, at the very, very top end. It used to be below 10%. Now it's typically over 20, and for whatever reason he was vulnerable, and their life has not been the same since. And there's debate about the science, but we certainly know that those young people are particularly vulnerable. And I think all we can do moving forward is try to, through regulation, through education, through having honest conversations about the society we actually live in and what the actual problems are in it, try to make things, try to give young people options that are as healthy and as safe as we can. And certainly that will be easier to do moving forward in an environment where we do have a monopoly on cannabis, where the supply of it is regulated, and where at least we can make the best choices possible given the tools at our disposal. A number of my colleagues have sort of waxed nostalgic for the say no to drugs era and that simple message. Well, simple doesn't necessarily mean truthful. And I remember watching a TV show when I think it was Different Strokes. You guys remember Different Strokes? I remember when Nancy Reagan made different political family. Made a guest appearance and did a lecture on saying no to drugs. And what we know, in fact, was that whole era was not only did it not work, it caused damage to communities. It was a way of continuing to invest a lot in drug enforcement instead of true justice. And I, for one, am perfectly okay with trying to tell our children and tell our communities and the residents of Nova Scotia a more nuanced but more truthful story about what cannabis is and about what choices we want to make with around where we spend our public dollars to support public health, to support harm reduction, and to support true justice in our communities. So thank you very much.